The Bookshop at the End of the Lane. A gentle story for peaceful sleep. In a small town where the streets curved and wound like the pages of an old book, there stood a bookshop that few people seemed to notice. It wasn't that the bookshop was hidden or difficult to find. It sat at the end of Ashwood Lane, a quiet street lined with elm trees whose branches formed a natural cathedral overhead. But somehow, people's eyes would slide past it, their minds preoccupied with other destinations, other purposes. The bookshop was called the Wandering Page, and it had been there for longer than anyone could remember. The building itself was narrow and tall, 3 stories of red brick with large bay windows that caught the afternoon sun. The front door was painted a deep forest green, and above it hung a wooden sign with gold lettering that had faded to a gentle patina over the years. The owner of the Wandering Page was a woman named Eleanor Hartwell. She was in her 60s, with gray hair that she wore in a loose bun, and reading glasses that perpetually hung from a silver chain around her neck. Eleanor had inherited the bookshop from her Aunt Margaret 30 years ago, and before that, it had belonged to her great-uncle Thomas, and before that, to someone else whose name had been lost to time. Eleanor lived in the apartment above the bookshop, a cozy space filled with even more books, a comfortable armchair by the window, and a cat named Dickens, who was orange and imperious, and believed himself to be the true owner of the establishment. Every morning, Eleanor would descend the narrow staircase from her apartment to the bookshop below. She would unlock the green door, turn the sign from closed to open, and begin her day among the shelves. The bookshop smelled of old paper and leather bindings, of wood polish, and the faint lavender sachets that Eleanor tucked between the books to keep them fresh. The interior of the Wandering Page was a labyrinth. Shelves lined every wall, reaching from floor to ceiling, and more shelves stood in rows throughout the space, creating narrow aisles that turned and twisted in unexpected ways. There were rolling ladders to reach the highest shelves, comfortable reading nooks tucked into corners, and a small fireplace near the back where Eleanor would light a fire on cold days. The books themselves were organized by a system that only Eleanor fully understood. Oh, there were sections: fiction, history, poetry, science. But within those sections, the arrangement seemed almost dreamlike. Books that wanted to be together found themselves side by side, regardless of author or publication date. A novel about the sea might sit next to a book of oceanography, which might sit next to a collection of poems about water. Eleanor always said that the books organized themselves, and perhaps they did. On this particular autumn evening, as the sun began its descent, and the light through the windows turned golden and thick as honey, Eleanor was shelving returns when she noticed something unusual. Between a worn copy of Treasure Island and a pristine edition of Moby Dick, there was a book she had never seen before. It was a slim volume bound in midnight blue cloth, with no title on the spine or cover. Eleanor pulled it from the shelf carefully, feeling the weight of it in her hands. The cloth was soft, almost like velvet, and when she opened it, she found pages filled with handwritten text in a script that seemed to shift and change as she looked at it, now bold and clear, now faded and dreamlike. She carried the book to her reading chair near the fireplace and sat down. Dickens immediately appeared from wherever he had been napping. settled himself on her lap, purring. Eleanor adjusted her glasses and began to read. The book had no title page, no author's name, no publication information. It simply began. There are places in the world where the boundaries grow thin, where reality and dream touch and sometimes merge. Bookshops are often such places, for within their walls, thousands of worlds exist side by side, separated only by covers and bindings. And of all the bookshops in all the world, some are thinner than others. Eleanor continued reading as the afternoon faded into evening. The book told the story of bookshops throughout history, not the famous ones, but the small, overlooked ones that had existed in the margins of cities and towns. It spoke of a bookshop in medieval Prague, where scholars came to read forbidden texts by candlelight. It described a tiny shop in Edo period Japan, where poetry was traded like currency. It told of a bookshop in New Orleans that appeared only on foggy nights and vanished with the dawn. As Eleanor read, she became aware of a strange sensation. The bookshop around her seemed to be expanding, growing larger and more spacious. When she looked up from the pages, she saw that the shelves had multiplied, extending further back than should have been physically possible. The light had changed too, becoming softer and more diffuse, as if it came from no particular source, but simply existed. Eleanor should have been frightened, but instead she felt a deep calm settle over her. She closed the blue book and stood, gently displacing Dickens, who gave her an affronted look before settling back into the warm spot she had left in the chair. She walked deeper into the bookshop, past the familiar shelves and into the new spaces that had appeared. The floor beneath her feet was still the same worn hardwood, but the shelves here held books she had never seen before. Some were bound in materials she couldn't identify, something that looked like pressed flowers, something that shimmered like fish scales, something that seemed to be made of compressed fog. In one aisle, she found a section labeled Books Not Yet Written. The shelves here held blank volumes, their pages waiting for words that would someday come. Eleanor pulled one down and opened it, and as she watched, faint letters began to appear on the page, then faded, then appeared again in a different configuration, as if the book were dreaming of what it might become. In another aisle, the section was labeled Lost Books. Here were the books that had been destroyed or lost to time. The burning of the Library of Alexandria, the lost plays of the ancient Greeks, the personal journals that had been thrown away by grieving relatives who didn't understand their value. But somehow, here they were, preserved in this expanded space. Eleanor ran her fingers along the spines, reading titles she had only heard rumors of. She pulled down a volume and opened it, finding it filled with beautiful illustrations of plants that no longer existed, botanical drawings of flowers that had gone extinct centuries ago, but lived on in these pages. As she explored further, Eleanor began to encounter other people among the shelves. At first, she thought they were customers who had come in without her noticing, but there was something dreamlike about them, something not quite solid. A young man in clothes from the 1920s was absorbed in a book of poetry, his lips moving silently as he read. An elderly woman in a Victorian dress was making notes in the margin of a botanical text. A child who couldn't have been more than 10 was was sprawled on the floor, surrounded by adventure novels, completely lost in a story. Eleanor approached the young man cautiously. "Excuse me," she said. He looked up, and his face was kind but distant, as if he were seeing her from very far away. "Hello," he said. "Wonderful bookshop you have here." "Thank you," Eleanor replied. "Have we met?" The young man smiled. "In a way. I used to come here long ago. Or I will come here in the future. Time works differently in bookshops, you know. It's all the stories. They create ripples, eddies in the flow of time." Before Eleanor could ask what he meant, he had turned back to his book and seemed to fade slightly, becoming more translucent, more like a memory than a person. Eleanor continued through the shelves, encountering more of these dreamlike readers. Each one was absorbed in their book, existing in their own moment of perfect contentment. She realized that these were the ghosts of all the readers who had ever found refuge in bookshops, all the people who had sought solace or adventure or knowledge between covers and bindings. She found herself in a section she didn't recognize, where the books seemed to be made of light and shadow. When she pulled one down, it felt weightless in her hands, and when she opened it, instead of pages, she found herself looking through a window into another place entirely. Through this window book, she saw a young girl sitting under a tree, reading. The girl looked up from her book and seemed to see Eleanor, and she smiled and waved. Eleanor waved back, feeling a connection across whatever distance separated them, space or time, or the boundary between real and imagined. She closed that book carefully and pulled down another. This one showed her a library in a grand house, where a fire burned in the hearth and rain pattered against the windows. A man sat in a leather chair, reading by lamplight, completely at peace. As Eleanor watched, he looked up and directly at her, and she saw that it was her great-uncle Thomas, who had owned the bookshop decades before she was born. "Uncle Thomas," she whispered. He nodded, though whether he could hear her or was simply acknowledging her presence, she couldn't tell. He held up the book he was reading, showing her the cover, and Eleanor saw that it was the same midnight blue book she had found on the shelf, the one that had started this whole strange journey. She closed that book too, and as she did, she heard music. It was faint at first, but as she followed the sound, it grew stronger. It seemed to be coming from the very back of the bookshop, from a place she had never noticed before. Eleanor walked toward the music, passing through aisles of books until she came to a door. It was small and arched, made of dark wood with a brass handle worn smooth by countless hands. She opened the door and found herself in a room she had never seen before. It was a library, but unlike any library she had ever imagined. The room was circular, with shelves that spiraled up and up, disappearing into darkness above. In the center of the room was a desk, and at the desk sat a figure writing in a large ledger. As Eleanor approached, the figure looked up, and she saw that it was an old man with a gentle face and eyes that seemed to contain all the stories ever told. "Welcome, Eleanor," he said, and his voice was like the rustling of pages. "Who are you?" she asked. "I am the keeper," he replied. "The keeper of all the stories, all the books, all the words that have ever been written or spoken or thought. Every bookshop in the world is connected to this place, and every bookseller is, in some way, a custodian of these stories." Eleanor looked around the impossible room. "Is this real?" The keeper smiled. "What is reality in a place made of stories? Is the emotion you feel when you read a novel not real? Is the knowledge you gain from a history book not real? Stories create reality as much as reality creates stories." He stood and gestured for Eleanor to follow him. They walked among the shelves, and the keeper showed her wonders. He showed her the first story ever told, a tale shared around a fire tens of thousands of years ago, preserved here not in writing but in memory, in the echo of the storyteller's voice. He showed her the books of the future, stories that would not be written for hundreds of years, but that already existed here in potential. "Why am I here?" Eleanor asked. "Because it's time for you to understand what you truly do," the keeper said. "You think you simply sell books, but that's not quite right. You are a guardian of doorways. Every book is a door, and every time someone opens a book in your shop, they step through that door into another world. You facilitate these journeys. You help people find the doors they need." They returned to the central desk, and the keeper opened the ledger he had been writing in. Eleanor saw that it contained names, thousands and thousands of names. Every person who has ever found the right book at the right time, the keeper explained. Every reader who has been changed by a story, who has found comfort or courage or understanding in words on a page. And here, he turned to a recent page and pointed, "Here are the people you have helped." Eleanor looked at the names and saw some she recognized. Mrs. Chen, who had been grieving her husband and had found comfort in a book of poetry Eleanor had recommended. Young Marcus, struggling in school, who had discovered a love of reading through a science fiction novel Eleanor had pressed into his hands. The business traveler who had stopped in one rainy afternoon and left with a mystery novel that had reminded him why he loved his work. "I didn't do anything special," Eleanor said. "I just gave them books." "You gave them exactly the right books," the keeper corrected gently. "That is a rare gift. Not everyone has it. You understand, perhaps without realizing it, what each person needs. That is why your aunt left the bookshop to you. That is why it has been in your family for generations. You are all guardians, all keepers of doorways." Eleanor felt tears prickling her eyes. She had always loved the bookshop, but she had sometimes wondered if her life was too small, too quiet, if she should have done something more significant with her years. "Your life is not small," the keeper said, as if reading her thoughts. "You have given people entire worlds. You have changed lives with stories. What could be more significant than that?" The music that Eleanor had heard earlier swelled around them, and she realized it was the sound of all the stories in all the books, harmonizing together, creating a symphony of words and meanings. "It's time for you to return," the keeper said, "but you will remember this, and you will understand now what you do. And when your time comes to pass the bookshop to another, you will know how to choose them." Eleanor nodded, feeling a fullness in her heart that was almost too much to bear. The keeper walked her back to the small arched door, and as she stepped through it, she felt herself moving backward through the expanded bookshop, past the ghostly readers and the impossible shelves, back toward the familiar. When she opened her eyes, she was sitting in her chair by the fireplace. Dickens was on her lap, purring. The midnight blue book was closed in her hands. The bookshop around her was its normal size, comfortable and familiar. But everything had changed. Eleanor looked at the shelves with new eyes, understanding now that they held not just books, but entire worlds, infinite possibilities. She understood that every person who walked through the green door was looking for something, even if they didn't know what it was, and that her job was to help them find it. The next morning, Eleanor opened the bookshop as usual. An elderly gentleman came in looking for something to read, and without hesitation, Eleanor walked to a shelf and pulled down a memoir she had recently acquired. As she handed it to him, she saw his face light up. "How did you know?" he asked. "This is about the town where I grew up. I've been thinking about it so much lately." Eleanor smiled. "Just a feeling," she said. Throughout the day, she helped customer after customer find exactly what they needed. A young mother found a book about patience. A teenager found a novel about finding your place in the world. A lonely widower found a book about carpentry and left planning a project that would fill his empty hours. As the afternoon turned to evening and the light grew golden again, Eleanor found herself back in her chair by the fireplace. She held the midnight blue book in her hands once more, but when she opened it, the pages were blank. The story had served its purpose. Now it was simply a book, waiting for a new story to fill its pages. Eleanor smiled and placed the book on the shelf, slipping it between Treasure Island and Moby Dick, where she had found it. Perhaps someone else would find it someday and have their own journey. Or perhaps it would simply remain there, a reminder of the magic that lived in bookshops, the thin places where stories and reality touched. That night, as Eleanor climbed the stairs to her apartment, Dickens weaving between her feet, she paused at the landing and looked back at the bookshop below. In the dim light, the shelves seemed to extend further than they should, the shadows between them deeper and more mysterious. She could almost see the ghostly readers moving among the aisles, lost in their stories, existing in that timeless space where all readers exist when they are truly absorbed in a book. Eleanor smiled and continued up to her apartment. She made herself a cup of tea, settled into her own reading chair by the window, and opened a book. As she read, she could hear the gentle sounds of the bookshop settling below her, the creaks and sighs of old wood, the whisper of pages turning in some otherworldly breeze. And somewhere, in the space between waking and dreaming, the keeper made a note in his ledger, recording another day, another set of stories finding their readers, another guardian doing her work well. The bookshop at the end of Ashwood Lane still stands there today, easy to miss if you're not looking for it, but impossible to forget once you found it. And if you ever find yourself on that quiet street, beneath the cathedral of elm trees, and you notice the narrow building with the red brick and the green door, step inside. Eleanor will be there, among the shelves, and she will help you find exactly the book you need, even if you don't yet know what that book is. because that's what she does. That's what she has always done. She is a keeper of doorways, a guardian of stories, a bookseller in a bookshop where the boundaries grow thin and anything is possible. Sleep well, and may your dreams be filled with stories.